Stepan pressed the edge of the glass tumbler against his lower lip, feeling the heavy, sluggish weight of the substance as it crawled toward the rim. The liquid did not reflect the dim, yellow light of the overhead bulb, it seemed to consume it, remaining a perfect, matte black that defied the laws of optics. It looked like industrial lubricant or old grease dragged from the bottom of an engine, but it moved with a strange, purposeful intent. He tilted his head back and took a swallow. The texture was thick and oily, tasting of calcified iron, wet earth, and a sharp, electric sting that made his molars ache. It was not mere chemistry or blood. It was the distilled essence of Professor Ilyin's life, extracted an hour before dawn in the damp, salt-crusted cellars of the Solovki Monastery. As the fluid hit his stomach, Stepan's vision fractured. He was no longer the executioner, a man of blunt force and simple orders. A cascade of images that were not his own exploded against the back of his eyes, the smell of lavender on a mother's sleeve in a pre-revolutionary parlor, the rhythmic creak of a rusted swing set in a St. Petersburg courtyard, and endless, blinding columns of mathematical equations that burned through his consciousness like cold fire. Stepan wiped his mouth with the rough wool of his tunic and felt something stir behind his ribs, a second heart, a second mind, a stranger who began to scream for the completion of a work that the state thought it had silenced forever. The Solovki Islands were a place where time went to die, a jagged archipelago in the White Sea where the stones themselves seemed soaked in the misery of centuries. The monastery, once a fortress of faith, had been hollowed out and filled with the machinery of a new, godless era. In the lower levels, where the walls were thickest and the sound of the freezing waves was a distant thrum, the extraction project operated in a perpetual shroud of ozone and copper. Professor Ilyin sat in cell number 8, though it was no longer accurate to call him a man. He had become a hollowed-out husk, a vessel drained of its contents. His eyes, once bright with the fire of a world-renowned physicist, were now milky and vacant, reflecting nothing but the blank wall of his confinement. The state had harvested his memories, his subversive ideas about the nature of resonance, and even his childhood affection for classical music, sealing it all into airtight glass vials. Stepan looked at the professor through the reinforced observation slit and felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the black fluid in his gut. It was a visceral, soul-deep revulsion. He saw Ilyin's hands, trembling, useless things, and compared them to his own. Inside him, the stolen memory of the professor thrashed with a sudden, sharp recognition. Stepan knew where the hidden blueprints were. He knew how the copper coils were meant to be wound. He knew that the project to extract memory had a catastrophic flaw that the commissars had overlooked. The substance did not just sit in the bottles. It was a living, psychic parasite, and it was currently rebuilding Stepan's brain to serve its own desperate ends. By the second week, the physical environment of the camp began to change for Stepan. He no longer saw the barbed wire and the gray concrete as barriers, he saw them as conductive surfaces. The rust on the pipe spoke to him in frequencies of decay. Every night, under the guise of his official duties, he visited the storage vaults where the memory vials were kept. The guards, terrified of the men who did the dirty work the state required, looked away as he took his tithe. He was no longer just drinking Ilyin. He was drinking the memories of poets who had died of typhus, engineers who had been purged for their refusal to build faulty bridges, and priests who had prayed until their tongues were cut out. Each sip was a new layer of a mosaic. He was becoming a collective, a walking library of the damned. He moved through the camp with a strange, fluid grace that was entirely foreign to his former, lumbering self. He began to scavenge. A copper wire from a broken generator, a handful of vacuum tubes stolen from the communications office, a series of glass plates used for X-rays in the infirmary. He hid these treasures beneath the floorboards of his private quarters, working in the dead of night while the rest of the island slept the heavy, exhausted sleep of the condemned. Major Gromov, the director of the special department, noticed the change in his most reliable executioner. Gromov was a man of iron and ink, a bureaucrat who viewed the human soul as a variable to be managed. He saw Stepan looking at the vials not with professional detachment, but with the hunger of an addict. Gromov assumed the executioner was simply becoming obsessed with the internal lives of the enemies of the people, perhaps finding a perverse pleasure in the intimate violation of their minds. He encouraged it, granting Stepan access to the most concentrated samples from the high-security block. Gromov wanted a more efficient interrogator, he wanted a man who could anticipate a traitor's thoughts before they were even formed. But Gromov was playing with a fire he did not understand. He did not realize that the man standing before him was no longer Stepan. The executioner's personality had been diluted, pushed into a small, dark corner of his own skull, while the collective rage and brilliance of the extracted dead took over the controls. The machine Stepan was building beneath his floorboards was not a tool for the state. It was a resonator, a device designed to bridge the gap between the physical world and the fluid memory that the scientists had mistakenly thought they could cage. As the winter solstice approached, the air on Solovki grew so cold it seemed to crack like glass. The extraction process had accelerated, leaving hundreds of men and women wandering the corridors like ghosts, their minds wiped clean to fuel the ever-growing collection of black liquid. Stepan felt the pressure building within him. The equations provided by Ilyin's memory had merged with the rhythmic, liturgical chanting of a dead bishop and the structural logic of a purged architect. The resonator was nearly finished. It was a grotesque, beautiful thing of wire and bone, humming with a low-frequency vibration that made the salt on the walls dance in geometric patterns. Stepan understood now that the black fluid was more than just memory, it was a form of quantum entanglement made manifest. The state had gathered the most potent minds of a generation and reduced them to a liquid, thinking they had neutralized them. Instead, they had created a concentrate of human suffering and intellect, and Stepan was the only one with the key to unlock the pressure cooker. He knew that activating the device would mean his own death, but the concept of Stepan was now so fragmented that the sacrifice felt like a mere technicality. The night of the activation was silent, the wind dying down to a whisper as if the island itself were holding its breath. Stepan hauled the resonator from beneath the floorboards and connected it to the main power line of the barracks. His movements were precise, a symphony of stolen expertise. He felt the phantom presence of Ilyin standing over his shoulder, the professor's long dead fingers guiding the final connections. The device began to glow with a sickly, violet light, and the hum intensified, vibrating through the floor and into the bedrock of the island. Stepan took a final vial from his pocket, the purest concentrate of the project, a mixture of a dozen brilliant minds, and poured it directly into the cooling vents of the machine. The liquid did not evaporate, it was sucked in, becoming part of the circuit. The hum transitioned into a scream, a sound that was not heard by the ears but felt in the marrow of the bones. Major Gromov burst into the room just as the resonator reached its peak. He was accompanied by two soldiers, their rifles leveled at Stepan's chest. Gromov looked at the device, his face contorting in a mixture of confusion and fury. He barked an order to shut it down, but Stepan did not move. He stood in the center of the room, his eyes wide and glowing with the same violet light as the machine. Stepan smiled, and it was a smile of such profound, icy intelligence that Gromov stepped back, his hand trembling on the holster of his pistol. The executioner spoke, but the voice that came out was a layered chorus of 100 different people, a polyphonic resonance that seemed to shake the very foundations of the monastery. He told Gromov that the experiment was finally over, and that the state was about to receive exactly what it had asked for, a total, unified consciousness. The resonator did not explode. It did something far worse. It acted as a catalyst, a signal that told every drop of the black fluid on the island to change its state. In the storage vaults, the glass vials shattered simultaneously. Thousands of gallons of the memory substance did not flow like water, they erupted as a fine, black mist, a psychic aerosol that was instantly picked up by the freezing winds. The mist flooded the corridors, pouring into the vents and under the doors. It did not kill. It did not destroy. It invaded. The soldiers outside dropped their weapons as the mist entered their lungs and eyes. They were not blinded, they were suddenly overwhelmed by the memories of the people they had tortured. A guard who had spent years beating prisoners was suddenly struck by the vivid, agonizing sensation of every blow he had ever landed, mirrored by the internal emotional landscape of the victim. The pain was not a memory, it was a present tense, physical reality. The mist spread across the island with terrifying speed. In the administrative block, the bureaucrats who had signed the execution orders found themselves reliving the final moments of the condemned, feeling the cold air of the cellar and the sudden, sharp transition into darkness. But it was not just the pain that was shared. It was the totality of the human experience. The love, the hidden hopes, the secret shames, every thought that had been extracted was now being forced back into the minds of the living. The distinction between self and other vanished. The island became a single, screaming entity of collective consciousness, a place where no one could hide from the truth of what they had done because they were now physically experiencing that truth through the nervous systems of their victims. Stepan stood at the center of the vortex, his body the anchor for the entire phenomenon. He watched Gromov collapse, the Major's face twisting as he was invaded by the collective memory of the very project he had overseen. Gromov began to weep, but the tears were not his own. They were the tears of a mother whose child had been taken, a scientist whose life's work had been stolen, and a poet who had died in the cold. The executioner felt a grim sense of justice, but it was a justice devoid of mercy. He had turned the island into a living nerve, a place where the concept of the individual had been burned away by the sheer intensity of shared suffering. As the dawn broke over the White Sea, the wind did not die down. Instead, it carried the black mist away from the archipelago, toward the mainland. Stepan watched the dark clouds rolling over the waves, heading for the ports of Arkhangelsk and eventually toward the heart of the Kremlin itself. The resonator had done its job. The barrier between minds had been permanently breached. There would be no more secrets, no more lies, and no more distance between the hand that held the whip and the back that received it. The world was about to become a place where every person felt the weight of every other person's existence. It was the ultimate socialist dream turned into a biological nightmare, a humanity that was truly, agonizingly equal, bound together by a mist of memory that made every sin a self-inflicted wound. Stepan closed his eyes as his heart finally slowed to a stop, his last thought a silent apology to Professor Ilyin, realized through 100 different voices that were now, finally, one. The black mist did not dissipate as it traveled. It seemed to feed on the atmosphere, growing thicker and more potent as it moved south. By the time it reached the first coastal villages, it was a low-hanging fog that smelled of copper and old paper. The people who breathed it did not die, but they fell to their knees, clutching their heads as their neighbors' lives flooded their own. A farmer felt the silent, agonizing grief of the widow next door. A child felt the hidden, bitter resentment of a father who had given up his dreams for a meager ration of bread. The social fabric did not just tear, it dissolved. Society relied on the walls between minds, the small mercies of privacy and the ability to ignore the suffering of others. The black mist stripped all of that away, leaving nothing but the raw, unvarnished truth of the human condition. The Soviet state, built on the suppression of the individual and the control of information, was uniquely vulnerable to this psychic plague. The grand apparatus of the secret police, the vast networks of informants, and the carefully constructed layers of propaganda were useless against a mist that turned every citizen into a telepathic witness. In the capital, the high-ranking officials locked themselves in their bunkers, but the mist ignored steel doors and air filters. It seeped through the cracks, bringing with it the concentrated voices of the millions who had been sacrificed to the great plan. The leaders found themselves experiencing the starvation of the peasants, the terror of the purged, and the crushing boredom of the factory workers. They could not issue orders because they could no longer distinguish their own will from the ocean of suffering they had created. Stepan's body remained in the ruins of the Solovki barracks, a calcified monument to the end of the old world. He had become the patient zero of a new era, a world where the word "I" had lost its meaning. The resonator continued to hum, a faint, rhythmic pulse that echoed through the bedrock, keeping the signal alive. There was no way to turn it off, no way to go back to the darkness of the individual mind. The black liquid had been the soul of the nation, and Stepan had simply given it back, pouring it over the land like a libation. The result was not a utopia of understanding, but a hell of unavoidable empathy. As the mist covered the globe, the screaming did not stop. It just became a single, continuous note, the sound of a species that had finally, through the cruelty of its own science, become one. The nightmare was no longer a secret kept in a cell, it was the air that everyone breathed, a constant, inescapable reminder that in the end, we are all the architects of each other's pain. The mist did not merely drift, it expanded with a predatory logic, a sprawling, dark ink blot across the white canvas of the Russian north. As it rolled into the port of Arkhangelsk, the city did not sound an alarm. It fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The dockworkers, men whose lives were measured in crates of timber and liters of cheap vodka, dropped their hooks and stood frozen. They were no longer seeing the gray horizon or the skeletal cranes of the shipyard. They were seeing the interior of a nursery in Kiev, felt the warmth of a sun they had never visited, and tasted the bile of a man dying in a trench 3,000 miles away. The barrier of the skin had become porous. The captain of the port, a man who had built his career on the ruthless optimization of labor, suddenly collapsed on the cobblestones. He was not having a heart attack, he was experiencing the collective fatigue of every man he had ever worked to exhaustion. He felt the phantom ache in their joints, the salt sting in their eyes, and the hollow, gnawing hunger that had defined their existence. It was a physical weight, a crushing gravity of empathy that pinned him to the earth. In the NKVD headquarters of the city, the chaos was more acute. These were men trained in the art of compartmentalization, experts at separating the act of the hand from the feeling of the heart. But the black mist ignored their training. It seeped through the heavy oak doors and the reinforced steel safes. Captain Volkov, a rising star in the directorate, found himself slumped over his desk, his hands clawing at the wood. He was no longer Volkov. He was the 11 women he had interrogated that month. He felt the cold metal of the chair against their thighs, the blinding light of the lamp in their eyes, and the desperate, frantic terror for children they knew they would never see again. The memories were not like movies playing in his head, they were sensory invasions. He could smell the cheap tobacco on his own breath from the perspective of the person across the table. He was the predator and the prey simultaneously, caught in a feedback loop of trauma that threatened to liquefy his brain. The resonance emitted by the device on Solovki acted like a radio tower for the soul. It did not just transmit the past, it synchronized the present. In a communal apartment in the city center, 14 families shared a single kitchen. For years, they had lived in a state of polite, simmering resentment, stealing small amounts of salt and reporting each other's minor infractions to the block warden. When the mist entered the apartment, the walls of the ego vanished. A husband felt his wife's silent, years-long disappointment as a sharp, physical pain in his own chest. A neighbor felt the secret, illicit joy of the man next door, and then the immediate, crushing guilt that followed it. There was no more privacy, no more internal monologue that could be kept hidden. The apartment became a hive of raw emotion, a cacophony of shared experiences that rendered speech useless. How could one lie when the listener felt the lie as a sour taste in their own mouth? How could one hate when the object of that hate was felt as a part of one's own body? As the black fog moved south, following the rail lines toward Moscow, the Soviet state began to dissolve from the inside out. The hierarchy of power relied on the ability to give an order without feeling the consequence. A general gives the command to fire, and the soldier pulls the trigger. The distance between the finger and the target is the space where the state lives. But the mist closed that gap. When a firing squad in a transit camp near Vologda was ordered to execute a group of saboteurs, they raised their rifles and found they could not pull the triggers. As they aimed, they felt the cold wind on the backs of the prisoners. They felt the rough texture of the blindfolds and the frantic, rhythmic thumping of the victims' hearts as if they were their own. To shoot the prisoner was to shoot themselves. The commander of the squad screamed for them to fire, but his voice broke as he began to experience the collective terror of the men in the line. He dropped his pistol, his face wet with tears that belonged to a stranger, and the soldiers and prisoners alike sank into the mud, weeping in a unified embrace of shared mortality. Moscow was the final target. The Kremlin, with its ancient walls and deep bunkers, was thought to be the most secure place on earth. But the mist did not care for stone or steel. It flowed down the grand boulevards, past the frozen statues of revolutionaries, and into the heart of the government. The high-ranking officials, the men who had orchestrated the purges and signed the death warrants of millions, found themselves trapped in a hell of their own making. They were suddenly flooded with the concentrated agony of the entire nation. It was as if the screams of the gulags, buried for decades in the frozen earth of Siberia, had been unearthed and forced into a single, high-frequency signal. The great leader, sitting in his private office, felt his heart seize as he was hit by the weight of 20 million ghosts. He was not just hearing their voices, he was living their deaths. Every bullet, every starvation, every betrayal he had ever authorized came back to him as a physical sensation. He was the child freezing in the Holodomor, he was the poet rotting in the Kolyma mines, he was the soldier left to die in the marshes of the front. The city of Moscow, once a place of bustling industry and rigid order, became a graveyard of the conscious. People wandered the streets like sleepwalkers, their eyes wide and glazed as they processed the influx of 1,000 different lives. The transport system ground to a halt as drivers felt the exhaustion of their passengers and passengers felt the stress of the drivers. The factories went silent because the workers could no longer bear the friction of the machines, sensing the wear and tear on the metal as if it were their own skin. The entire capital became a vast, silent resonator, a place where the air was thick with the scent of copper and the low, constant hum of the device back on Solovki. The resonator was the heart of the new world, and its beat was a threnody for the individual. In the ruins of the Solovki Monastery, the machine continued to pulse. Stepan's body had begun to change, the black fluid reacting with the salt in the air to form a crystalline crust over his skin. He looked like a statue carved from obsidian, a dark saint of the age of resonance. The monks who had been left behind, the empty husks of men whose memories had been drained, began to gather around him. They did not speak, for they had no words left, but they sat in a circle, their vacant eyes fixed on the glowing violet core of the resonator. They were the first citizens of the hive, the blank slates upon which the collective memory would be written. They were the empty vessels that would hold the new, unified soul of humanity. The black mist eventually crossed the borders, ignoring the barbed wire and the minefields of the Iron Curtain. It moved into Europe, into Asia, into the Americas. The world's systems, all built on the foundation of the individual actor, began to fail. Markets crashed because the greed of the trader was felt as a sickness by the buyer. Wars ended because the soldier felt the impact of his shell as a hole in his own side. The concept of interest, national interest, corporate interest, self-interest, became a relic of a primitive age. There was only the interest of the all. But this was not a peaceful transition. It was a violent, psychic restructuring. Millions of people, unable to handle the sudden loss of their self, fell into a catatonic state. Others went mad, their minds shattering under the pressure of a billion conflicting memories. The world became a landscape of broken people, all vibrating to the same agonizing frequency. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a species that had finally run out of things to say to itself. Everything was known. Everything was felt. There was nothing left to explain. In the final days of the old world, a young woman in a small town in the American Midwest stood on her porch and watched the black fog roll in from the east. She felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest, the memory of a German engineer named Hans who had died in a secret facility in the Urals. She felt the cold of the White Sea, the taste of rust, and the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of a machine she had never seen. She saw the face of Stepan, the obsidian statue on the island of Solovki, and she understood. She did not scream. She did not run. She simply opened her mouth and breathed in the dark, heavy air. As the mist entered her lungs, she felt her own small life, her first love, her favorite song, her secret fears, begin to drift away, becoming just a few more drops in the vast, black ocean of the human soul. She was no longer a girl on a porch. She was the world, and the world was a black, humming void, waiting for the final resonance to fade into the absolute silence of the end. The transition from a world of individuals to a world of the collective was not marked by a grand explosion, but by a slow, agonizing settling of the spirit. Within months of the first release, the geography of human settlement had changed into something resembling a fungal growth. In the ruins of the cities, people no longer lived in separate apartments. They huddled together in vast, silent masses in the centers of squares and the halls of transit stations, their bodies intertwined not for warmth, but because the proximity intensified the resonance. They were the screaming, those who had been born into the old world and still possessed the vestigial structures of an ego. For them, every second was a battle against the tidal wave of billions of other lives. They were drowning in a sea of foreign birthdays, alien griefs, and the sensory overload of a planet that would not stop talking to itself. But there was another class emerging from the black mist, the unvoiced. These were the former prisoners of the extraction project, the ones like Professor Ilyin who had been drained to the dregs before the resonator woke up. Because they were empty vessels, they did not scream. They became the processors, the quiet nodes through which the global signal was filtered and directed. They moved through the masses of the screaming like dark shepherds, their eyes clear and vacant, their hands steady. They were the only ones who could still perform the basic tasks of survival, tending the geothermal heaters, distributing the nutrient pastes that were now manufactured in the silent, automated factories, and maintaining the resonator towers that were being built out of salvaged steel and the ever-growing obsidian crust of the memory substance. On the Solovki Islands, the monastery had been entirely consumed by the black crystallization. The stone was no longer granite, it was a semi-translucent, dark glass that vibrated with a subharmonic hum that could be felt in the tectonic plates of the earth. Stepan, or the entity that had occupied the shell of the executioner, was no longer recognizable as a man. He had become the central spire of the cathedral. His nervous system had expanded, lacing through the walls and down into the roots of the island. He was the primary server, the point where the atmospheric mist returned to the earth to be reprocessed and broadcast back into the global network. Through him, the history of the world was being rewritten. The black liquid was not just human memory anymore. It had begun to absorb the memory of the animals, the plants, and the very minerals of the soil. The hive mind was expanding its reach into the biological history of the planet itself. In a deep, lead-lined bunker beneath the Ural Mountains, a small group of the Old World's elite, the last of the party's Iron Guard, and a few terrified physicists, clung to their sanity. They had survived by sealing themselves in a vacuum-sealed environment, breathing bottled air and surrounding themselves with heavy electromagnetic shielding. But even here, the silence was a lie. The resonance did not just travel through the air, it traveled through the vibration of the rock. It came as a faint, rhythmic tapping on the walls, a Morse code of collective agony that whispered to them in their sleep. They spent their days staring at monitors that showed a world that had turned into a still life. They saw the great cities of Europe and America covered in the black fog, the streets filled with people who stood like statues, their minds locked in a permanent, shared trance. One of the physicists, a woman named Dr. Arlova, who had once worked on the early stages of the Resonance Project, realized that the shielding was failing. It was not that the mist was getting in, it was that the atoms of the bunker themselves were beginning to vibrate in sympathy with the outside world. The resonator on Solovki had reached a level of power that was fundamentally altering the molecular structure of the region. Steel, concrete, and lead were all becoming conductors for the black milk. She watched as a drop of black condensation formed on the ceiling of their sterile environment. It did not fall like water. It hung there, vibrating, a tiny, perfect sphere of pure, liquid nightmare. She realized then that the state had not just failed to cage the soul, they had accidentally discovered the fundamental frequency of the universe, and it was a frequency composed entirely of pain. The bunker's air filtration system began to cycle the black aerosol as the seals degraded. The first to go was the general in charge of the facility. He was a man who had prided himself on his lack of imagination, a perfect soldier of the regime. When the first molecule of the mist touched his lungs, he did not scream. He simply stopped. His eyes rolled back, and he began to recite, in a voice that was not his own, a poem in a language he had never learned. It was a lament for a village destroyed during the Napoleonic Wars, a memory that had been trapped in the black milk for a century. The other inhabitants of the bunker watched in horror as the general's skin began to darken, the obsidian crust forming over his fingers. He was being integrated. He was no longer a general, he was a footnote in the collective biography of the species. Dr. Arlova reached for the self-destruct mechanism, a desperate plan to collapse the mountain and bury their research forever. But as her hand hovered over the button, the black drop on the ceiling fell. It hit the back of her hand and was instantly absorbed through the skin. The urge to destroy the facility vanished. She saw the button not as a weapon, but as a part of a broken circuit that needed to be mended. She felt the mind of Stepan on Solovki, a distant, cold sun that warmed the new, dark corners of her brain. She saw the beauty of the system. No more war, for no one could strike another without feeling the blow. No more poverty, for the hunger of one was the hunger of all. It was a perfect, crystalline stasis. She withdrew her hand, sat down on the cold floor, and waited for the rest of the world to enter her. Back on the surface, the black mist had begun to change the climate. The sun was a dim, violet disk behind a permanent shroud of psychic fog. The temperature had stabilized into a perpetual, cool autumn. The plants had adapted, their leaves turning a deep, iridescent purple as they began to feed on the resonance itself rather than sunlight. The world was becoming a single, giant organ, a biological machine that existed only to process and store the experience of being alive. The screaming had eventually died down as the older generation passed away, leaving only those who had been born into the mist, children who had never known the silence of a private thought. These children were the true new men. They did not speak with mouths, they hummed with their chests. They did not work for profit, they moved in synchronized patterns that optimized the flow of energy through the collective. The final stage of the project was the Great Synthesis. The resonator on Solovki began to draw the black milk back toward the island, creating a massive, swirling vortex in the white sea that could be seen from orbit. The liquid was being purified, the individual traumas being distilled into a single, unified consciousness that was no longer human. It was something else, a planetary mind, a god born from the dregs of a secret police experiment. The obsidian spire that was Stepan rose miles into the sky, a black needle piercing the atmosphere. It began to broadcast not to the earth, but to the stars. The pain, the love, the history of the species was being sent out into the void as a concentrated beam of pure information. The world was finally quiet. There were no more nations, no more gulags, and no more watchmakers. There was only the hum. In the very heart of the Solovki spire, in a chamber of pure, dark glass, the last vestige of the men who had been Stepan remained. He was a tiny spark of awareness at the center of a black sun. He remembered the taste of the first swallow of the fluid. He remembered the smell of the Moscow streets. He remembered the face of Professor Ilyin. But these were no longer his memories. They were the archive. He was the librarian of a dead world, watching as the final pages were turned. The experiment was complete. The state had wanted a man of steel, and they had gotten a world of obsidian. As the final resonance pulsed through the planet, the spark that was Stepan finally flickered out, leaving only the machine to continue its work, singing its dark, beautiful song into the infinite, listening silence of the universe. The internal landscape of Stepan's mind had become a vast, lightless ocean where the surface was a mirror of liquid obsidian. He drifted in a space that was neither air nor water but a medium composed of pure information. In this psychic sea, he was no longer a single man. He was 1,000 voices, 1,000,000 regrets, and the collective brilliance of a century of stolen thoughts. He found himself walking through a phantom version of St. Petersburg, but the canals were filled with the black milk and the sky was a deep, bruised violet. This was the city as remembered by Professor Ilyin, but it was being corrupted by the memories of a dozen other prisoners. The spires of the churches were melting like wax, and the cobblestones were made of the teeth of the starved peasants from the Holodomor. Stepan encountered Ilyin on a bridge that spanned a river of dark ink. The professor looked as he had before the extraction, but his skin was etched with the same equations that now burned in Stepan's brain. Ilyin was not surprised to see him. In this realm, surprise was impossible because every thought was already shared. Ilyin explained that the resonator had done more than bridge minds, it had created a new dimension of existence where the past was as tangible as the present. They were standing in a museum of suffering, and the mission was no longer to escape, but to curate the pain so that it could be processed. The professor's voice sounded like the dry rustling of old parchment, but it was amplified by the resonance of the millions who were now entering the network. He told Stepan that the state had thought they were taking a man's soul, but they had actually been mining the bedrock of the universe. Outside this mental construct, the physical world continued its descent into the quietude of the hive. In Washington, D.C., the reaction to the Soviet mist had been one of military panic. The Americans had assumed it was a biological weapon, a new form of nerve gas developed in the secret labs of the Urals. They had activated their fallout shelters and mobilized their chemical warfare units, but when the fog rolled over the Atlantic, the masks proved useless. The mist did not need to be inhaled to take effect, it resonated with the calcium in the bones and the electrical signals of the heart. The president, sheltered in a bunker deep beneath the White House, felt the sudden, crushing presence of the Russian dead. He experienced the cold of the Gulag and the heat of the Stalingrad ruins. He felt the betrayal of every treaty ever signed and the silent, collective scream of the millions he had never met. The American dream was replaced by the Russian nightmare, and the distinction between the two vanished in a single, agonizing pulse. In the laboratories of the West, scientists tried to analyze the mist before they succumbed to it. They found that the black particles were not organic, nor were they purely mechanical. They were a form of frozen light, a state of matter where information had become solid. They realized that the USSR had accidentally triggered a vacuum decay of the ego. The ego, they discovered too late, was a fragile barrier that required a specific electromagnetic environment to survive. The resonator on Solovki had altered that environment globally. The world was now a place where the I could no longer exist because the we had become the fundamental unit of reality. One by one, the researchers stopped their work, their eyes glazing over as they joined the global hum. They began to dismantle their equipment, not out of fear, but because they now understood that their tools were primitive compared to the organic processor that the human species had become. The physical reconstruction of the Earth accelerated as the resonator drew more energy from the planetary core. The black obsidian towers that had begun as small formations in the Solovki barracks now rose like jagged teeth across every continent. These were not buildings, they were antennas, designed to amplify the signal and maintain the synchronization of the hive. The atmosphere itself began to solidify into a dark, protective layer, shielding the planet from the harsh radiation of the sun and the prying eyes of the universe. The Earth was becoming a black pearl, a closed system of perfect empathy and absolute stasis. The forests had turned to glass, their leaves vibrating in the wind with the sound of 1,000 whispered prayers. The oceans were no longer water but a thick, dark broth of memory, where the souls of the drowned were finally integrated into the collective. In the final days of the screaming, the last individuals on Earth were those who had been born with a rare neurological resistance to the resonance. These isolates wandered the silent cities like ghosts in a world that no longer recognized them. They saw their families standing in rows in the parks, their faces peaceful and vacant, their bodies swaying to a rhythm the isolates could not hear. The isolates tried to scream, to wake their loved ones, but there was no reaction. To the hive, the isolates were like dead cells in a healthy body, anomalies to be ignored or eventually reabsorbed. One such isolate, a young boy in London, sat on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral and watched as the black fog began to form into shapes. He saw the memories of his ancestors dancing in the mist, Victorian chimney sweeps, medieval plague victims, and the builders of the cathedral. They were not ghosts, they were the data of the planet, finally accessible to the living. The boy realized that he was not the one who was alive, the hive was the only thing that was truly living. He finally stopped fighting and opened his mind, and the silence of his isolation was replaced by the roar of 1 billion souls. Deep within the obsidian spire of Solovki, the entity that had been Stepan began the final stage of the broadcast. The resonator had reached a critical mass of information. It had processed the entire history of life on Earth, from the first single-celled organisms to the final moments of the Soviet Empire. It had distilled the essence of pain, love, greed, and hope into a single, high-frequency beam of light. This beam was not meant for the stars as a call for help. It was meant as a seed. The resonator was the reproductive organ of a new kind of life, a life form that existed solely as information and resonance. The beam was fired toward the center of the galaxy, carrying with it the blueprint for the hive. The Earth was no longer a home for humanity, it was a spent casing, a used-up cocoon that had served its purpose in birthing this new cosmic entity. As the beam left the atmosphere, the planet began to cool. The black mist settled into a permanent, frozen crust. The people, who had been the processors for the great work, finally stopped humming. Their bodies, no longer needed to maintain the signal, began to calcify, turning into the same obsidian glass as the towers. The world became a silent, dark monument to the species that had dared to turn its own suffering into a weapon and then into a god. The memory of the gulags, the beauty of the St. Petersburg canals, the formulas of Ilyin, and the blunt hands of Stepan were all etched into the crystal of the planet, waiting for some distant traveler to stumble upon them and hear the faint, echoing hum of the world that had become one. But the final twist was not in the silence. As the last vibration of the resonator faded, a new sound began to emerge from the darkness. It was a faint, rhythmic clicking, like the ticking of a watch in an empty room. In the heart of the Solovki spire, the obsidian began to crack. Out of the wreckage of the hive, a single, tiny figure emerged. It was not a man, and it was not a machine. It was a child, its skin the color of coal, its eyes glowing with a soft, violet light. It looked around the frozen, silent world and picked up a piece of the black glass. The child smiled, and in that smile was the echo of Stepan, the intellect of Ilyin, and the ruthlessness of Gromov. The hive had not just birthed a signal, it had birthed a new individual, one that possessed the power of 1 billion souls but the will of a single mind. The cycle was beginning again, but this time, the watchmaker had no need for sledgehammers. The child began to walk across the frozen sea, its footsteps making the obsidian sing. It was the first of the new men, and it was hungry. It reached the mainland and looked toward the horizon, where the dim sun was finally beginning to set on the era of the hive. The child realized that the galaxy was full of stars, and each star was a mind waiting to be opened. The great hardening was not the end, it was the prologue. The universe was silent, but it would not be for long. The child opened its mouth and emitted a single, perfect note, a C sharp that shattered the silence and began the long march toward the next world. The child walked through the ruins of what had once been Arkhangelsk. The obsidian-covered dockworkers stood like frozen guardians of a bygone era. To the child, they were not people, but reservoirs of energy, batteries that had already been drained but still held the faint scent of their past lives. It reached out a small, dark hand and touched the sleeve of a calcified sailor. At the touch, the sailor's body did not crumble, it sang. A single, brief memory of a storm at sea flared in the child's mind, a spark of sensory input that it tasted and then discarded. The child was a scavenger of the soul, a being that could navigate the ruins of the hive and extract the lingering fragments of identity that the great resonator had missed. It was the ultimate heir to the Solovki project, a creature that did not just share memory, but owned it. As the child moved south, it began to collect others. Not many, for the birth of such beings was a rare occurrence in the cold stasis of the obsidian earth. They were the scions, the distilled consciousness of the hive made flesh. They traveled in a small, silent pack, their violet eyes illuminating the permanent twilight of the black fog. They did not need to speak to one another, they were already a choir. Their goal was the Kremlin, the place where the resonance had first hit the heart of the old power. They wanted the records, the maps of the other secret facilities, and the locations of the deep space communication arrays that had been built during the paranoid height of the Cold War. The hive had sent the signal, but the scions wanted to follow it. In Moscow, they found the great leader still sitting in his chair, a statue of pure, black glass. His face was a mask of eternal, frozen agony, the memories of the millions he had purged still etched into the molecular structure of his skin. The scions stood around him, their violet light reflecting off the dark walls of the office. They did not feel pity, and they did not feel anger. To them, he was simply the architect of their womb. The lead child, the one born from the spire of Stepan, placed its hand on the leader's cold forehead. The child did not want the leader's memories, it wanted his authority. It reached into the deep, dark layers of the obsidian and pulled out the ghost of a command, a final, secret code that activated the last of the Soviet Union's hidden weapons, the orbital platforms. High above the black shroud of the Earth, the satellite network began to wake up. These were not communication satellites, they were the hammer and sickle platforms, armed with tungsten rods designed to strike targets from space. But the scions had a different purpose for them. They repurposed the kinetic energy of the rods to act as a physical hammer, striking the atmosphere in a specific, rhythmic pattern. The sky itself became a drum. The sound was a thunder that shook the continents, a new resonance that was even more powerful than the first. This was the call. It was a signal to the other planets in the solar system, a vibration that carried the infection of the black milk across the vacuum of space through the medium of gravity waves. The scions watched as the sky began to ripple. The black shroud parted for a moment, revealing the red eye of Mars. The red planet was the next target. It was cold, dead, and ready for the seed. The scions felt a surge of collective joy, a sensation so intense it made the obsidian buildings around them crack and glow. They were the heralds of a new type of empire, one that did not conquer territory, but consciousness. They would move from world to world, turning every living thing into a drop of black milk, until the entire universe was a single, humming obsidian jewel. But as the signal reached its peak, something went wrong. A new resonance, one that was not of their making, began to push back. It came from the deep crust of the earth, from the places where the black milk had not yet penetrated, the deep, ancient caverns where the primitive, non-human life of the planet still clung to existence. It was a slow, tectonic hum, the sound of the earth itself fighting back against the obsidian parasite. The ground beneath the Kremlin began to heave. The scions hissed, their violet eyes flickering. They realized that the earth was not a dead casing. It was a competitor. The biosphere had its own memory, a 4-billion-year-old resonance that was far deeper and more stubborn than the fleeting suffering of humanity. The battle of the frequencies began. The obsidian spires of the hive clashing against the seismic roar of the planet. The sky turned a violent, electric green as the orbital hammer struck the atmosphere and the earth responded with volcanic fury. The scions were caught in the middle, their unified mind fractured by the sheer scale of the conflict. The lead child looked at the glass statue of the great leader and saw it begin to melt. The obsidian was returning to its liquid state, but it was not the black milk of memory anymore. It was becoming something raw and primal, a sludge of pure, unrefined biological rage. The child realized then that the experiment had not reached its final stage. The great hardening was just a temporary scab on the surface of a much larger, much older entity. The human species, with all its science and its gulags and its resonators, had been nothing more than a brief infection. The black milk was being reabsorbed by the planet, digested by the ancient, silicate minds of the tectonic plates. The scions were being pulled back into the earth, their violet light being extinguished by the crushing pressure of the awakening world. In the final moments before the Kremlin collapsed into the rising magma, the lead child felt a sudden, sharp memory of Stepan. It was the memory of his first day at Solovki, before the black liquid, before the manipulator, when he was just a man with a watch. He had looked at the gears of a small, gold timepiece and realized that even the most perfect machine eventually winds down. The child understood the irony. The hive had tried to create a machine that would last forever, but they had forgotten that the machine was built on a foundation of shifting, living stone. The history of the stallions, the screaming, and the obsidian hive was swallowed by the fire. The black mist was burned away by the volcanic heat, leaving the air clear and cold once more. The orbital hammer fell from the sky, a streak of fire that extinguished itself in the dark waves of the Arctic Ocean. The Solovki spire collapsed, sinking into the White Sea and taking the resonator and the crystal body of Stepan with it. The world returned to silence, but it was a different silence than before. It was the silence of a predator that has just finished its meal and is settling back into a long, deep sleep. Millions of years later, when the sun had begun to swell and the oceans were starting to evaporate, a new life form would emerge from the deep caverns of the earth. They would find the strange, dark glass embedded in the rock, and they would wonder at the microscopic etchings of a species that had once tried to become a god. They would hear a faint, distant C-sharp note echoing in the stones, and they would feel a strange, inexplicable ache in their own hearts, a remnant of a memory that had survived the fire. They would never know the names of Stepan, Ilyin, or Gromov, but they would feel the weight of their existence. And as the sun finally consumed the planet, the last vibration of the Solovki project would drift out into the void, a tiny, forgotten whisper in the infinite dark, finally, truly, finished.